the most dangerous and most wanted man in Mexico, whose capture was worth 15 million. He did not fall because of a drone. He did not fall because of a cell phone interception. He fell for something much simpler, much more terrifying. Two governments were looking for him, and for more than a decade, no one found him. Until today, February 22nd, 2026. There are things you know will happen sooner or later, and when they happen, they still surprise you. They still leave you speechless, because one thing is knowing that something will occur someday, and another very different thing is that that day is today, that it is this Sunday, that it is in the early morning hours, that it happens this way, in that lost place among the mountains of Jalisco that few people know and that today the whole world is searching for on the map. This story starts earlier, much earlier. It begins in a town that almost no one has heard of, in the heart of Michoacan, where a boy left school in 6th grade because his family had no other choice. That boy was named Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes. And that boy, the one who picked avocados in the fields to help his family, the one who did not finish elementary school, the one who went north without documents looking for something better, that boy became the most wanted man in Mexico, the man for whose head the United States offered $15 million. $15 million written out, because sometimes numbers are not enough to understand what that means. But wait, because before telling you what happened this morning, before telling you how all this ended, there are things you need to know. There are things people do not know about this man. There are things that do not appear in the newspapers. And there is something that happened in today's operation. Something I am not going to tell you yet. Something that, when I do tell you, will change the way you are understanding everything you are hearing right now. That is why you should stay, because the most important part of this story is not that they found him. The most important part is how and what they found with him, and what that tells the world about who this man really was. Beyond the name, everyone knows. Naranjo de Chila, that is the name of the place, a small hamlet in the municipality of Aguililla, Michoacan, one of those communities that exist on the map, but that for most people do not exist anywhere else. Dry land, land of hard work, a land of people who get up before dawn and go to bed with their bodies worn out. Nemesio was born there on July 17, 1966. He grew up in that community, saw his parents work, saw what it meant to have nothing, and made a decision like many young people from that region made at the time. He went north. He went to the United States without papers, like people went to look for something, to look for anything, and what he found was not exactly what he was looking for. In California, while still very young, he began selling drugs, small quantities, the business of those who have no other business available, according to the logic of those who lived it from the inside. But they caught him. In 1992, he and his older brother Abraham were arrested after selling heroin to two undercover police officers. They were sent to a federal prison in the United States. Later, they were deported. He returned to Mexico, and Mexico, for someone with that record and nothing else, did not have many doors open. Or maybe it did, but they were not doors one would want to open if one knew what was on the other side. He arrived in Tijuana. Tijuana in the 1990s was another world. It was a world with its own rules, its own owners, its own codes. And Nemesio learned those codes quickly, faster than most. He built connections. He built a name. Then to Jalisco, and there he did something that still surprises those who study his history today. He joined the police. He became a police officer in Tomatlan, a municipality on the Jalisco coast, and from inside the police he learned how everything works, how those who pursue you think, how they organize, are where the blind spots are, what mistakes are always made. That information has no price, and he knew it. But wait, because there is something in this story that still does not fit. There is something that those who knew him closely, those who speak carefully and in half words, say, that he was never only what he seemed to be, that there was a layer beneath the layer everyone saw. And that layer is what matters to understand what happened this morning in the mountains of Jalisco. I am not going to tell you yet, but stay, because it changes everything. What I can tell you is that when Nemesio approached Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, the famous Nacho Coronel, things began to move differently. Nacho Coronel was a man with power, with connections, with territory, and he saw in Nemesio something worth using. He's something uncommon, a combination of coldness, tactical intelligence, and an ability to move in the shadows that very few possess. When Nacho Coronel fell in July 2010, something broke in the existing order, but something also opened, a space, a vacuum, and Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, together with Eric Valencia Salazar, the man known as L85, decided that space was theirs. That is how what the world would later know was born. That is how everything began. And what began there did not stop. It did not stop for years. It did not stop even when government said it was stopping. It did not stop even when a price was put on his head. It did not stop even when people close to him were captured, including his own son Ruben Gonzalez. El Menchito, arrested in 2015 and extradited to the United States years later. It did not stop until this morning. There is something investigators who followed this story for years always say, that El Mencho survived so long not only because of his cruelty, but because of something much harder to fight, his paranoia, his discipline, the way he operated. This man trusted no one, and that is not an exaggeration. It was part of his method, part of what kept him alive when so many others fell. He did not use phones zones the way other people did. He did not meet in the same places. He did not have a single hideout. He moved, always moved. And when he stayed still, he did so in places where no one expected him to stay still. The mountains of Jalisco. That was his refuge. The mountains, the dirt roads that do not appear on any digital map, the small communities where people knew him or feared him, or both at the same time. Italpa de Allende. If you look for that name on a map, you will find a municipality in the Jalisco highlands, known mainly for its religious sanctuary, for the Virgin of Talpa, one of the three most important sanctuaries in Jalisco, a place of pilgrimages, a place where people go to ask for miracles. But behind that image, for years, that area was also territory that El Mencho considered his. Territory where he had eyes, where he had ears, where no one who should not be there arrived without him knowing, or so he believed. Hold on to that image for a moment. A man who built an entire protection system, who turned the mountains into his wall, who for years disappeared from every radar screen, who dodged operations, who survived information leaks from within his own ranks. A man who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. How do you reach someone like that? That was the question those who worked for years to hunt him asked themselves. And when the answer came, it was not what anyone expected. It was not something big and loud. It was something much smaller, much quieter. But I am not telling you that yet, because there are parts of this story you need to hear in order for them to make sense. What I can tell you is this. There were people who spent years gathering pieces, small pieces, movements, patterns, silences that say more than words. And those pieces little by little began to form something. 2021 was an important year in this story, even if it did not seem like it at the time. In November of that year, authorities arrested Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, El Mencho's wife, in Zapopan. Now, the woman identified as a key piece on the financial side of the organization, the woman who, according to the investigation, managed money flows described by investigators as part of a structure parallel to everything visible. When she was arrested, El Mencho did not react the way analysts expected. There was no immediate response like in other similar situations. There was silence, a silence some interpreted as indifference, but others, those who knew him better, interpreted as something else: fear. Not the fear that paralyzes you, but the fear that makes you disappear even more. The fear that makes you pull back, change everything, trust fewer people, move differently. And that withdrawal, that change and movement pattern, also leaves traces. Traces that are not easy to read, but that someone who knows how to read them can follow. Were they followed? That was part of what led to today's operation. I cannot say for sure yet, because there are parts of this puzzle that are still unconfirmed. But there is something that is confirmed, something sources were clear about this morning. Today's operation was not improvised. It was not something that just happened suddenly. This had been planned for a long time. Let us talk about what happened before dawn. On this Sunday, February 22nd, 2026, the mountains of Jalisco at dawn have their own language. The sounds of the countryside, the cold of the mountains, the roads that at that hour are empty of everything except those who have reasons to be there at that time. The Mexican army, together with other federal forces, moved toward the Talpa de Allende area. It is not a small municipality in terms of size. It is mountains, a forest, complicated territory for any operation. And that was exactly why that place had functioned as a refuge for so long. But this time something was different. Something about this early morning operation was different from previous attempts, and those involved knew it. They felt it. In these operations, when the level of information being handled is different, when those giving orders speak in a different way, when preparations are of a type that is not the usual, the people inside the operation notice it. They feel it in the air. This dawn, that was felt. The first reports that began to emerge did not speak directly about what had happened. They spoke of an operation, of troop movements, of a cordoned-off area. They spoke of reactions that began almost immediately. Road blockades, vehicles set on fire in Jalisco, then in Michoacán, then in Colima, then in Guanajuato, then in Tamaulipas, then in Aguascalientes. 6 states in a matter of hours. That does not happen by accident. That happens when someone gives an order, when a structure that was waiting for that signal receives that signal. And what was the signal? What triggered coordinated reactions in 6 states at the same time? That was what no one wanted to say yet this morning. Sources spoke. They spoke anonymously, carefully. They spoke of a successful operation. They spoke of the security cabinet issuing an official statement in the coming hours. But there was something in how they spoke that said more than words. An official, consulted by one of the country's most important media outlets, responded to a direct question with several seconds of silence before speaking. And when he spoke, what he said was enough for the journalist to understand that what had happened in those mountains was definitive. Why that silence? Why that pause before responding? Because confirming what had happened was not just giving news. It was opening a door that, once opened, could not be closed. It was setting in motion a series of consequences that decision-makers knew would be difficult to manage. And they were right. The reactions in those 6 states showed it in real time. Pause here for a moment, because before continuing, there is something I want you to keep in mind. Something important to understand the rest of this story. When an organization like this loses its leader, what happens next does not follow a predictable script. It is not simple. It is not that one day there is a leader and the next day there is not, and everything dissolves. It does not work that way. It never has. What happens is more complicated and more dangerous in many ways. There are cells that have been operating semi-autonomously for years. There are figures who have been waiting for a moment like this. There are internal rivalries that were contained by the presence of that name, that figure, that fear the name generated. And when that name disappears, all those contained tensions seek an outlet. That is what security experts began saying this morning, that today's event is a huge blow, the biggest in many years in Mexico, but that the consequences will be complex, that the work ahead is as difficult or more difficult than what led to this point. But that is later. That is what comes next. For now, let us stay with what happened in Talpa de Allende in that February dawn, with that operation that had been planned for a long time and that reached its final point this morning. There is a question everyone is asking today, a question journalists are asking, analysts are asking, people on social media are asking, how did they find him? And that is exactly the right question, because the answer to that question is the most important part of this story. It is the part I have not told you yet. It is the part that changes how one understands everything that led to this moment. And I am going to tell you. I am going to tell you in a few minutes. But first, I need you to understand something about how this man operated, about how difficult he was to track, about what kind of system he built to remain invisible. Because without understanding that, the answer will not seem as important as it is. El Mencho understood something many in his position do not understand or do not want to understand, that the technology that protects you today is the same technology that betrays you tomorrow. And that made him distrust technology, cell phones, modern communication systems, anything that depended on a signal that could be intercepted. Instead, he developed something older, slower, harder to penetrate, a network of human messengers, trusted people who carried messages from one point to another, a system that reduced the speed of his communications but gave him something more valuable, invisibility. And that worked for years. Operations that arrived late, information that always seemed to arrive after he had already moved, are the feeling among those pursuing him of always being one step behind. But what happens when that system begins to crack? What happens when the human chain begins to give way? What happens when someone in that chain, for whatever reason, starts to speak differently? That is what some still do not know. And that is part of what I am going to tell you, but not yet. Let us return to Sunday morning. Let us return to Jalisco. Governor Pablo Lemus activated the Security Council before the sun had fully risen. That is important. It says something about what the state was facing at that moment. The blockades were not in one place. They were in several municipalities at the same time. Roads cut off, vehicles in flames, people unable to leave their homes. Lemus asked for calm. He asked people to follow official channels, not to expose themselves. To be patient, words one uses when situations are serious and when the situation on the ground is still evolving. Michoacán activated its own protocols. Governor Alfredo Ramirez also set up his Security Council, and shortly afterward, violent reactions reached Colima, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, Aguascalientes, a chain of reactions in 6 states, coordinated in their effects, if not in their exact origin, as if someone had sent a signal and everyone responded at the same time. And in the midst of all that, federal authorities kept official silence. They spoke to the media unofficially, anonymously, but the official statement, the one that would publicly and formally confirm everything, had not yet arrived. Why that official silence? Why take time in a situation like this? There are several possible reasons. One is verification, fully confirming that the person who fell in that operation was who they said he was. That takes time. It requires procedures. Something like this is not announced without being completely certain. But there is another reason too, one that has to do with what they found, with what was with him, with what came out of that operation besides the main result. And that, I am going to tell you. But first, let me finish telling you who this man was, because if you only know him by name, if you only know him by what newspapers say, you are missing something. Nemesio Oseguera. Cervantes built something that went beyond what any similar organization had built before in Mexico. It was not just a distribution network. It was not just territorial control. It was something more like a parallel state with its own logic, its own economy, its own informal justice system, enforced by methods the people living in those areas knew very well. The organization he led became something U.S. authorities described as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, in Mexico, in the world. And when the administration of President Donald Trump designated this organization as a foreign terrorist organization, that was not just a symbolic declaration. It was a recognition that what it represented went beyond what conventional organized crime language can describe. Terrorism. That is the word they used. And that has very specific implications in terms of how it can be pursued, how that pursuit can be funded, what kind of international cooperation can be mobilized. The DEA had him on its most wanted list, $15 million. That was the reward the U.S. State Department offered for information leading to his capture or prosecution. $15 million, an amount that says something about the level of priority this man represented for the most powerful government in the world. Mexican authorities also offered their own reward, 30 million pesos for information leading to his capture. 2 governments, 2 intelligence systems, 2 security apparatuses with enormous resources, years of pursuit, and yet, until this dawn, Nothing. What changed? That is the question. That is the central question of this story, and we are reaching the point where I can begin to tell you the answer. Not all at once, because this answer also has layers, parts that are better understood if heard in a certain order. But we are there now, because what happened in Talpa de Allende this dawn did not begin in Talpa de Allende. It began much earlier, in a place few would have imagined, and that place has to do with something El Mencho never believed would be his weak point. He never trusted technology, but he did trust people. And people, unlike technology, have fears. They have family. They have limits. They have moments when the weight of what they know becomes heavier than the fear of what might happen to them if they speak. Someone spoke. I cannot tell you who, not because I do not want to, but because honestly that is not publicly confirmed yet. But what is clear, what investigators involved in this operation let slip in conversations with the media, is that the information that made today's operation possible did not come from a technological interception. It did not come from a drone. It did not come from a satellite. It came from inside. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters. A man who built his protection system on distrust, who feared a cell phone conversation more than any operation, who survived for years precisely because he minimized the number of people he trusted. That man, with all that system, with all that paranoia built as a shield, was reached by something he could not control. Loyalty has a limit. It always has a limit. And when that limit breaks, when it breaks in the right way at the right moment with the right person, everything else stops mattering. The walls, the dirt roads, the mountains, the human messengers, the alternative communication systems, all of that is of little use when someone who knows exactly where you are decides to say it. Previous operations arrived late because the information arrived late. This time, the information arrived on time. That is the difference. That is the difference that makes this story end the way it ends. And what happened when the army arrived at that point in the mountains of Jalisco, in that rugged area of Talpa de Allende, before the sun rose this Sunday, that is what I still need to tell you in more detail, because that is where the part no one expected lies. The part that made officials who spoke to the media this morning speak with that pause, with that silence before responding. But before getting there, I need to tell you something about the last years of this man, about what became of him after he lost people close to him, after his son was captured, after his wife was arrested, or after the organization he built began facing pressure from multiple fronts at the same time. Because there is an image most people have of El Mencho, the image of the powerful, untouchable man who orders and is obeyed, who appears in videos threatening other organizations, authorities, the government. That image existed. It was real at one point. But the last years, according to those who tracked him closely, painted something different. A man who could no longer trust the same people as before because those people had changed, had been captured, had disappeared. A man with health problems reported for years, a diabetes that, according to some, cost him part of a leg, that made him dependent on medication and medical care that is very hard to obtain when one is hiding in the mountains. A man, in short, who remained powerful for what he represented, for the structure he had built, but who physically, humanly, was paying the price of decades of living the way he lived. Does that make him less dangerous? No, not at all. The organizations he built do not disappear with him. The semi-autonomous cells continue to exist. The networks he wove are still there. But it does make the image of the untouchable man, the man who seemed beyond the reach of any operation, an image that was always partially false, because no one is truly beyond reach. No one. And that brings us back to this dawn in the mountains, to what happened. The operation was coordinated by the Mexican army with participation from other federal forces. The mountainous areas of Talpa de Allende, identified as zones of organizational activity, each were the destination of a deployment planned with a level of detail previous operations did not have. High-level sources from the security cabinet confirmed it to several media outlets, not just one, and all said the same thing. The operation had concluded with the result everyone understood was being announced, even if no one said it in those words yet. The governor of Jalisco activated Code Red in the state. That is not done lightly. Code Red is the highest alert. It is the official recognition that the situation on the ground is serious and that maximum resources and coordination are required. And the reactions in those 6 states, Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, and Aguascalientes, continued unfolding as all this happened. Vehicles burned, roads blocked, businesses affected, people unable to move. I mean, the opposite of what many expected the reaction to be when this day arrived. Not relief, but a wave of coordinated chaos that showed that the organization, although wounded in a way it had never been before, still had response capacity. And now I will tell you what was still missing, what they found in that place in the mountains of Jalisco, along with Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. It was not just what one would expect to find in a hideout of someone who had spent years moving through mountain ranges. There was something more, something officials who confirmed the news mentioned obliquely, something that has to do with the real reach of what this man handled, not in abstract terms, not in terms of political power or distribution routes, in very concrete, material terms. Documentation, information, the kind of information that, and when in the hands of authorities, changes an investigation, not only about him, but about other things. things, about connections, about names, about flows, about what this man knew and how high what he knew went. Because that was always the most difficult issue to understand from the outside. El Mencho was not just an operator. He was someone who had information, who had accumulated information for decades about people, institutions, agreements that existed in the shadow world where he operated. And that information, now in other hands, is what investigators will spend the coming months analyzing. What can open investigations that do not yet exist? What can confirm suspicions that until today were just that, suspicions? That is the real impact of what happened this morning. Not just the fall of a name, but the opening of everything that name protected with its silence. There is one more thing that matters to tell about how the army reached that place. The identification protocols activated after the operation were not improvised. They were protocols designed for this specific moment, to avoid what had happened in other similar situations in the past. Doubt, the possibility of error, the question the world would ask if an announcement were made. And later, it turned out not to be who they said it was. That took time. That is part of why the official statement had not yet arrived at the time the operation occurred. Because those who manage these situations know that confirmation has to be solid. It has to be definitive. Because the cost of an error in an announcement like this would be enormous. And the confirmation arrived, unofficially first, through high-level sources who spoke with multiple media outlets. And then the formal process followed its course. $15 million. That was the reward on this man for years. $15 million that someone, at some point in this chain, made possible to earn. Not necessarily in the literal sense that someone will cash that check, although that could also happen, but in the sense that someone took the step that made everything else possible. And that someone, whoever they are, made a decision that could not have been easy. Because living in that world and deciding to speak is not something done without consequences. It is not something done without knowing there is a price that is not money. Let us return to the streets of Jalisco this morning. And while security forces handled the blockades, while the governor spoke of Code Red, while reports of chaos arrived one after another in 6 states, something else was happening more quietly. The people, the ordinary people, those who live in those regions and who for years knew that something existed in those mountains, even if they never said it out loud. The people who lived under the shadow of a name that was not pronounced in certain contexts, that was not mentioned in front of certain people, that functioned as a presence even when it was never visible. What do those people feel today? That is a question with no simple answer, because they do not feel just one thing. They feel several things at the same time, and some of those things are contradictory. There are those who feel that something ended, that a weight that was never named but always carried has disappeared, at least in part, that the figure representing something well known in those communities is no longer there. There are those who feel fear of what comes next, because in these territories, when the order of power changes, the period that follows is not necessarily calmer. Sometimes it is more dangerous, because the vacuum attracts those who want to fill it, and those who want to fill it are not always gentler than what was there before. And there are those who simply do not know what to feel yet, who are processing, who are waiting to see what happens in the coming days, to know how to interpret this moment. These 3 kinds of responses exist today in Jalisco, in Michoacan, in Aguilita where he was born, in the places that knew his name up close. Now let us return to the question that matters most for understanding the future. The question security analysts are answering today across all media. What comes next? That question matters most to understand the future. And it is the same question ordinary people, those who live in those states, municipalities, mountain communities, are asking too, but with an important difference. When an analyst asks it, they ask it from the outside, from a desk, from a television studio. When someone living in Talpa de Allende or Aguililla or one of the municipalities in Colima that woke up to blocked roads asks it, the question has a different weight, because for them it is not an academic question. It is a daily life question. Can I go out tomorrow? Will my children get to school safely? Can my business open without problems? And that difference matters. It matters a lot for understanding why these stories do not end with an operation, because the day after is always more complicated than it looks from the outside. Organizations like the one El Mencho led do not function like a company where if the CEO disappears, everything stops. I have said it before, but it is worth staying on it longer. It is worth understanding why, when Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was captured and later extradited to the United States, many people thought it would radically and quickly change the landscape. And yes, it changed the landscape, but not the way many expected. What followed was fragmentation, a dispersion of power that had previously been concentrated. And that dispersion, paradoxically, in many regions made things harder, not easier, because instead of one structure with internal logic, hierarchies, and tacit agreements about limits, what remained was a map of smaller, more unpredictable groups, more willing to use violence because they did not have the same deterrent capacity as the original structure. Will the same thing happen now? The fall of El Mencho will lead to a similar process. Experts who spoke today do not agree on the outcome. Some say yes, that the pattern will likely repeat, that there are figures within the organization who had been disputing power spaces in recent years, that the fragmentation process had already begun before today, and that this morning will only accelerate it. Others say this situation is different, that the organization El Mencho built had a more centralized structure than others, that it depended more on his personal figure, his presence as a cohesive factor than similar organizations, and that therefore the fall of that figure could have a faster and deeper destabilizing effect. Neither group has certainty about what will happen, because these things cannot be predicted precisely. They depend on too many variables: who moves first, what information different groups have about the current state of the organization, what alliances exist and which will hold and which will break now that the name holding them together is gone. What is certain is that the Mexican state will have to be prepared to manage that process, and that the information that came out of today's operation, what was found in those mountains, what is now being analyzed, will be central to that preparation. There is something international media will highlight heavily in the coming hours and days, something related to the political context in which this operation occurred. Relations between Mexico and the United States on security matters have gone through difficult moments in recent years. There have been tensions over cooperation, over the level of access U.S. agencies have in Mexican territory, over the terms of that cooperation, over sovereignty limits and international pressure. And yet, in this operation, in this morning's result, there is something that says that cooperation, despite all those tensions, continued functioning at the levels where it matters most, because the intelligence that made this possible is not built only from within. It requires collaboration. It requires data sharing. It requires channels that work even when diplomatic relations are complicated on the surface. The DEA spent years documenting this man, building one of the most detailed files that exists on any organized crime figure on the continent. And that file, that accumulation of information over years, was part of what made today's operation possible. Does that give credit to joint work? Does it show that security cooperation has value beyond political tensions of the moment? That is what officials from both countries will say in the coming hours, that this result shows collaboration works, that there are things that can only be achieved when both sides of the border work in the same direction. They may be right, or the story may be more complicated than that. There may be parts of how this point was reached that will never appear in any official statement, that will remain in private conversations, classified files, testimonies that, if ever given, will be given in a very different context than a press conference. That too is part of how these stories work. The official version and the complete version are not always the same. But let us return to something I mentioned earlier and want to expand on, because I think it is important. The part of this story that is most easily lost amid operations, statements, and geopolitical analysis. The blockades in 6 states that occurred hours after the operation were not just an operational response by the organization. They were not just a show of capacity. They were also something more human and more terrifying. And they were the expression that there are people, real people, who receive orders, who carry them out, who go out to block roads, burn vehicles, create chaos in communities where other people live who have nothing to do with any of this. Who are those people? What leads them to be there, carrying out those orders at that moment? That is the question never well answered in security analysis, because security analysis treats those people as actors in an equation, as pieces on a board. And they are not that. They are people with histories, with contexts, with reasons that led them there, reasons that are complicated and do not fit neatly into a single category. Some are there because they had no other option, or because they believed they did not. Some are there because fear was greater than any other consideration. And some are there because at some point in their lives they made a decision that led them there without necessarily seeing from the start where it would end. And some are there because they believed in something, in an order, in a structure, in a logic of belonging that offered what other things did not: identity, purpose, a place in the world. That is not an excuse. It is not a justification. The damage they caused is real. The consequences of their actions are real. But if one wants to understand why these things exist, why they persist, why they do not disappear when a figure falls, one has to be willing to look at those parts too. Talpa de Allende has an image in the Jalisco and Mexico imaginary that is completely different from today's headlines. It is a mountain municipality of tradition and faith. On the Virgin of Talpa is one of the 3 Jalisco sanctuary virgins pilgrims visit on long walks that sometimes last days. People come from many parts of the state, the country, to fulfill promises, give thanks, ask for miracles. That municipality, that place of pilgrimage, is the same place where one of the most important operations in Mexico's recent history occurred this dawn. That contradiction says something. I am not sure exactly what, but it says something about how things that seem opposite coexist in the same territory: faith and fear, tradition and unspoken violence. The paths pilgrims walk and the dirt roads that appear on no map and are known only by those who have reasons to know them. Mexico is full of those contradictions, places that are 2 things at once, that have 2 histories running in parallel. One told out loud, and another that exists in the silence of those who know but do not say. And what happened this morning in Talpa de Allende is part of that longer story, not just about this man, but about what Mexico has been during the decades in which these forces grew into what they became. There is a fact in the files worth mentioning because it says much about the scale of what this man represented. The United States offered $15 million for him. The U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned him. His assets in that country, those that could be identified, were frozen. There were travel restrictions, alerts in multiple international systems. And yet, the organization he led continued operating, continued growing in some territories, continued generating money flows, investigators described in figures difficult to imagine in real terms. How is that possible? How can something like that exist in front of all that pursuit apparatus? The answer has several layers. One is geography. Mexico's mountains favor those who want to hide. They are vast. They are difficult to fully monitor. They have communities that live by their own logic, far from the control systems that function in urban areas. Another layer is corruption, not as an abstract phenomenon, but as something very concrete. People in positions of authority who received something in exchange for looking the other way, who leaked information, who warned of operations, who made it possible for someone to remain invisible inside a system supposedly looking for them. How many times did information arrive late because someone deliberately made it arrive late? How many previous operations failed, not because intelligence was bad, but because someone inside the system warned before the operation reached its destination? Those questions still have no public answers, but they are part of the real story, the story beyond what statements will say. And it is possible that part of what they found in today's operation, part of that information I mentioned earlier, has to do precisely with that, with who, when, how that parallel protection system worked, one that was not just the mountains, not just human messengers, but also had an institutional dimension that is hardest to speak about out loud. Let us talk about something else that matters in this story: time. This man was active for more than 3 decades. 3 decades in which Mexico also changed. Governments changed. International relations changed. Technology changed. The world changed. And he changed with it. That is something those who studied him constantly highlighted. He was not a static operator. He learned. He adapted his methods. When something stopped working, he looked for something different. He began in times when cell phones did not exist or were very rare. He operated through the explosion of digital communications, through the era of drones, through the development of surveillance systems that were once science fiction. And at each stage, he adapted to remain invisible within each new technological context. That requires intelligence, not the kind measured in a classroom, but the kind developed in practice, in observation, in reading the environment and understanding what makes you vulnerable at each moment. A man who left school in 6th grade, who did not finish elementary school, and who nevertheless built an operational system that allowed him to remain invisible to 2 of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatuses on the planet for more than a decade. That says something, not about whether what he did was right or wrong, there is no ambiguity there, but about what kinds of intelligence exist outside formal systems, about what capacities develop in contexts that should never have produced what they produced. There is more in this story I have not fully told you yet, something about the people closest to him, about family. When one thinks about these stories, family appears in a very specific way, as an extension of power, as an instrument of control, as part of the structure. And in part, that is true. Our members of El Mencho's family were involved in the organization's operations. That is documented. His son Ruben Gonzalez, El Menchito, was captured in 2015 and extradited to the United States years later. His wife Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia was arrested in 2021. There are brothers and relatives in the files, but there is another reality, the one that does not appear in the files. Those who did not choose, those born into that context without choosing which family to be born into, those who grew up with a last name carrying a weight they never put there. What happens to those people today? What does what happened this morning mean for them? Those are questions no government statement will answer, questions that may never have public answers, but they exist. They are part of this story, even if they do not appear in headlines. And speaking of what does not appear in headlines, there are communities in Jalisco and Michoacan that for years lived under the shadow of what the organization this man led represented in their territory. Communities where the presence was daily, where the organization provided things the state did not: employment, local security by its own logic, conflict resolution its own way, support in times of need, a parallel economy that in those communities was not parallel because it was the only one that existed. That is a phenomenon academics study, and politicians prefer not to discuss much because discussing it requires acknowledging that there are parts of national territory where the state has not truly arrived, not effectively, not in ways that genuinely change people's living conditions, and that in that vacuum, other logics grow, on other structures install themselves, and once installed, they are very difficult to replace with something different because the different thing is not yet available. What happens in those communities today? What happens when the structure that provided certain things in the way it did is no longer there? It is not that the structure was good, it was not, but it was what existed. And when what existed disappears without something genuinely replacing it, the vacuum can be as hard to live with as what was there before. That is what those working in community development, peace and security, and state building in vulnerable territories have said for years. Operations are necessary necessary but not sufficient. Behind every successful operation must be a plan for what comes next. Who arrives in that territory? Which institutions, which services, which state presence that is genuine and sustained over time. Without that, the cycle continues with different names, different figures, but the same underlying logic. Let us return to the mountains. To that Sunday dawn. There is something mentioned briefly in today's reports that deserves more attention. The level of logistical preparation of the Talpa de Allende operation. This is not an easy place to reach. It is not a place where one can easily move a large force without being noticed. The roads are difficult. The terrain is irregular. The people who live there know the environment and notice when something different is happening. That means the logistics of this morning's operation had to be extraordinarily careful. The movement of forces had to be done in a way that did not alert. That did not arrive early to people who could warn. That did not trigger the alert systems this man had built in that territory over years. How do you do that? How do you move a significant military deployment into the mountains without it being noticed until it is too late to matter? That requires coordination at the highest level. It requires compartmentalization of information, that as few people as possible know what is going to happen, that movements are disguised as something else until the point of no return. And it requires intelligence so precise that the margin of error is minimal. Because in that type of territory, with that type of target, an operation that arrives 10 minutes late can be an operation that arrives too late. This time, it did not arrive late. This time, the information was precise. Why? And the execution matched the quality of that information. That is what makes this operation different from previous ones. Not just the result, but the process that led to it. I want to talk about something important to me. Memory. How we will remember this day in 10 years, in 20. There are events that, when they occur, seem like the end of something, and over time are seen as the beginning of something else, the inflection point that marks a before and after, even if at the moment it is not fully clear what the after will be. Is this one of those events? Possibly. It is possible that in 10 years those who study Mexico will see February 22nd, 2026 as one of those moments, the day something changed irreversibly in the country's criminal power map. But it is also possible that what comes next is so complicated that that inflection point blurs, that the fragmentation following this fall produces new dynamics so difficult to manage that today's operation becomes just another chapter in a longer story with no visible end yet. We do not know. No one can know today because the effects of an event like this are seen over time, in what happens in the following months, in how remaining structures respond, in how the state responds, in what decisions are made with the information obtained. What we do know is that today something happened that cannot be undone, that has consequences, that moves the board significantly, and that the work ahead is of a magnitude that requires being equal to what this operation represented. There's one last thing I want to tell you before closing this story. Something about numbers, about figures. For years, El Mencho's name appeared linked to figures difficult to imagine in concrete reality. Tons of drugs, millions of dollars, numbers of operations, numbers of territories controlled, numbers of people involved in the structure. Those figures are important to understand scale, but they can also make one lose sight of the human element, make everything seem abstract, a huge-scale problem, a sociological phenomenon, a statistic. And it is not that. It never has been. Behind every number are people. People who consumed what that organization distributed, people who live in communities affected by what that organization did in their territory, on people who worked within that organization for complicated reasons not easily summarized in one word, people in institutions who looked the other way or actively participated in making all this possible for so long, and people who for years worked to make today arrive. People in the Army, the Navy, intelligence agencies, investigative teams who built files, followed leads, assembled pieces, endured years when results did not come, who kept working even when previous operations arrived late. Those people are also part of this story, the part that appears least in headlines. The sun finished rising over the mountains of Jalisco, over Talpa de Allende, over dirt roads that no longer have the same meaning they had 24 hours ago. The blockades in the 6 states began to be lifted slowly during the day, carefully, because although the immediate cause of the reactions had been neutralized, the situation on the ground remained delicate and required careful handling. The official statement from the federal government arrived. It confirmed what unofficial sources had already said. It confirmed it with the formal language of government statements, with correct names, verified data. And the world reacted as it reacts to this type of news. International media ran the story. News agencies distributed it. Governments with an interest in the case issued their own statements. The DEA spoke. The State Department spoke. And in the mountains of Jalisco, in a place that returned to the silence it always has, the sun continued rising over trees and dirt roads, as it does every day, regardless of what happens below. Naranjo de Chila, Michoacan. My 78 years of a story that began in an avocado field and ended in a mountain range where roads do not appear on maps, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the most wanted name in Mexico for more than a decade, neutralized in the early hours of this Sunday, February 22nd, 2026. And what remains, what always remains, the questions that have no answer in a statement, the consequences that will unfold in the coming months, the information being analyzed, the names that will appear in that information, the investigations that will open, and the communities, the people, those who lived under that shadow and who today, even with fear of what comes next, breathe differently. That too is part of this story. The longest part, the one that does not end today, the one that is only just beginning. If you made it this far, it is because this story captured you from the beginning and you could not let go until the end. And that makes sense because there are stories one needs to hear in full, stories that require time and attention. Up on the screen there is another video, another story with the same weight that will capture you in the same way. Click it, because what comes next deserves to be heard just as much as what you have just heard.